Alright, hello and welcome to another edition of Sack Mate Pretends That He Can Still Play Classical Chess. For those of you who don't know me, I am International Master Alexander Katz, better known as Sack Mate online. And in 2025, I have taken the full year off of work in order to pursue my lifelong dream of obtaining the Chess Grandmaster title. As we saw in my last series about the Blitzfield Invitational, we began the year with a very, very difficult 9-round round-robin event. It went okay, basically average for my rating. My rating pretty much didn't move. Could have gone a lot better, could also have gone a bit worse. So a relatively sort of standard result to start off the year. But this month we were taking on a very different type of challenge in the US Amateur Team East. Now, if you're not familiar with team chess, you might wonder what that even means. You know, chess is inherently an individual game. Like, are you getting like a bunch of people together to like in a huddle to collectively decide what move you're going to play? Is every player like responsible for one piece on the board that they have to move? It's a very good question. You know, chess is a very difficult game to make into a team sport, which is one of the many reasons that it's sort of struggled to gain mainstream popularity. But the way that team chess generally works, basically, is that you have a team of some number of players. In this tournament, it was 4. The Olympiad, it's also 4, and something like the Bundesliga, it's like 6 or 8, depending on the country. So you have these 4 players. They face off against another team of 4 players, and they have their highest rated players play one individual game, their second highest rated players play one individual game, and so on. And whichever team collectively scores more points in these individual games wins the match. So in a four-person team, you're aiming for 2.5 points. There's no direct communication between teammates or anything. You have no direct influence on your teammates' games. It's still 4 individual games. But as we'll see, there are some sort of unique considerations that occur in a team chess event versus an individual one. The other feature of this tournament is, because it's sort of an amateur tournament, it's intended to appeal to a very, very wide variety of chess players, not just professional ones like the Bundesliga or the Olympiad. The average rating of your 4-person team is capped to 2200 US rating, which is roughly equivalent to, let's say, like a 2100 FIDE rating, maybe a little bit lower, 2050. Again, you know, as I've talked about in the past, the FIDE ratings in the US have a very, very wide spread, especially at the lower levels. So a 2200 USCF player could have a FIDE rating of like anything, ranging from, 1500 to 2250. So there's not like a direct comparison, but that's roughly the level that you would expect the higher level teams to average out to. And this poses some interesting questions of how you want to compose your team. You know, the only restriction is that your average rating has to be below 2200, so you could have a very, very strong player on board 1, even also on board 2. And balance it out with comparatively weaker players on boards 3 and 4. You could even, have a team that's very, very strong players on boards 1, 2, and 3, and balance it out with like a complete beginner on board 4. And there have been teams that do this, and they're generally extremely strong and win the event easily, so there's some additional restrictions on teams of that composition. But generally, you have either a team that has a decently strong player on board 1, title player, sometimes a grandmaster, a reasonable sort of master tier player on board 2, and then boards 3 and 4 tend to be experts, maybe slightly lower class A players. Or you have a team of 4, master level players and have to try to make a very, very balanced lineup. And we'll see examples of both of those throughout the tournament, but my team in particular was sort of a balance between the two. I was playing board 1. My US rating is only 2450 right now, so that gave us a lot of wiggle room. Our board 2 was a master level player, around 2200 US rating. Our board 3 was an expert, around 2100 rating, and our board 4 was around 1900, a fairly strong class A player. So our average rating worked out to about 2170 or so, I believe, which is one of the stronger teams in the event. Put us, I think, the 9th seed, maybe the 10th seed, somewhere around there. It's not exactly clear because the ratings that they choose to use are a little bit outdated so that you can register early. But somewhere around like the top 10 teams, and so we were definitely coming in hoping to win the event. Now, this is a very large event. There are 350 plus teams participating, and it's a very short event. There's only 6 rounds, one of the, a very, very short event by chess standards. So in a very, very large field with a very small number of rounds, you should generally expect, and you might be wondering, like, well, aren't there going to be like 5 or 6 perfect scores, like a lot of them? And this is somewhat true. Often, maybe, I'm not sure about most years, but often there's usually at least 1, maybe 2 perfect scores. And the reason there aren't more is because the tournament uses what is called accelerated pairings. So normally, normal pairings, you would have the top seed play against the top seed of the bottom half of the tournament, second seed plays the second seed of the bottom half of the tournament, so on. But to accelerate the pairings, because this would produce some really lopsided matches in the first round, they pretend basically that the first round already happened, and that every higher rated team won, and then proceed from there. So you skip the lopsided matches at the beginning, because generally speaking, you're not going to lose. You're not going to expect like a 2100 team to lose to like a 1700 team. You might expect like one 2100 to lose to a 1700 in an individual game every so often, but with 4 games, the variance is very, very low. And so you just sort of skip round 1 and progress from there. And then eventually in the middle of the tournament, they sort of take away that free point and start to pair normally. But for the first couple rounds, you get much harder matchups than you would expect, and this is balanced out by somewhat easier matchups in the middle of the tournament than you would normally expect. And so in the first round of this tournament, despite being, as I said, one of the top 10 seeds in the tournament, we were playing what was already a fairly strong team, and my game in particular was against a fairly strong opponent, a high scorer by the name of Roger Zhang, who had a 2250 USCF rating. So really not that low, or somewhere around 2250. I'm not sure the exact number. So playing black against these, 2250, 2300, 2350 kind of range of players is often very unpleasant, because they are definitely strong enough to give you a very, very serious challenge. It's not a game where you can just sort of expect to mess around and win regardless. These are very, very strong players most of the time, and so especially the opening choice is very difficult. And this is compounded by it being a team event where if you actually lose this game on board 1, which is very possible, I mean, I certainly shouldn't pretend like I don't lose to 2250s with some regularity. This sort of has like a pretty devastating effect on the rest of the team, because, as I said about team composition, we've sort of allocated like a great deal of points to board 1. I'm 250 points above the average rating, so we basically given up 250 points from the other boards. And so this calls for a very, very high score from board 1, more than you would normally expect. Like if I played black against a 2256 times in a tournament, I really wouldn't expect more than 4 or 4.5 points, or the ELO rating system wouldn't expect me to score more than 4 or 4.5 points. But in a tournament like this, you actually have to be scoring 5.5, 6. 5.5 is kind of the bare minimum. Maybe 5 is like okay sometimes, but 5.5 is basically like what you need to do. So I pretty much have to win at every game, especially in the early rounds, because the later ones will be harder. And so in this particular game, after my opponent played e4, I decided not to play one of the more solid standard openings that I've been playing recently, such as either e5, which I have most of my games in, c6 for the Caro-Kann. c5 I've been experimenting with a bit. You can definitely play this against lower rated players, but I wasn't super confident in my opening knowledge there yet. And instead go back to an opening that I played pretty religiously as I was rising through the ranks, which is d6, initiating the Pirc defense. Now, the problem with the Pirc defense is that it's a very bad opening. Objectively speaking, white has a number of routes to a very, very serious advantage. But the advantage is that you keep all the pieces on, it becomes a very, very strategically complex fight. And so it's a very, very common go-to opening for some of the top players in the world, even when they are facing a slightly weaker player, not like a much weaker player, then they'll often just choose a standard opening. But against a slightly weaker player, they'll often go for a Pirc defense, either through d6 or sometimes through the knight c6 move order. Both are sort of viable ways to get sort of a fresh position, one that your opponent probably hasn't studied super deeply. You're giving up certainly a very serious advantage at the opening, but you keep all the pieces on, the fight remains complex, it's a good opportunity to try to outplay your opponent later on in the middle game. So my opponent continued along standard lines. Black also has the option here of playing e5, which transitions back to a sort of Philidor type position. This is also a very viable way to play for a win. It's one that I've used myself many times, but in this game I decided to stick with the more normal Pyrrhic structures with g6. And here white has a very, very wide choice of how to challenge this opening. Bishop e3 is very common, intending queen d2 and trying to start an immediate attack on the king side. F4 is a very big system as well, trying to make a very large center and take advantage of the fact that black is not really challenging the center and wasting time fianchettoing the bishop. But in this game, my opponent played the very classical approach with knight f3, prioritizing rapid development. There's a lot of theory in this line as well, and it's certainly one of white's best. And after bishop g7, my opponent chose the slightly unusual line h3. This is definitely still very well studied. This is one of white's major systems. But more common is, if you're going to go for knight f3, much more common is to play bishop e2, aiming for quick castling and continuing sort of the theme of rapid development. So the question is, okay, why are we playing h3? It seems like a bit of a strange move to throw in the opening. It's not like black was really going to play the move bishop to g4, where it would be immediately harassed and have to trade itself off. There are almost no lines where black wants to do that and give away the advantage of the two bishops very early. And so the point of h3 then is actually mostly to stop the move knight g4, which at the moment doesn't do anything, but it would annoy the bishop coming to e3. So if white were to immediately play the move bishop to e3, then black technically could play knight g4 here. Probably won't do it immediately, but it is an option, hitting the bishop, and then the bishop doesn't actually have that convenient a square to go to. In fact, it might actually go back to c1, and we'd see a repetition. So h3 is aimed at securing the future for the bishop, and so after castles, which I played, white went ahead and played bishop to e3, sort of taking advantage of the new cemented position that it has. So this is all still a very big theory. White also has the option of going back to the classical variations with bishop to e2, but the bishop will come to e3 sort of in any case, and the light square bishop has more options of where it wants to develop. So generally you start with the piece that you know for sure is going to go to this position and defer the decision of where to put the light square bishop to later. So in this position, black has a few plans that he can pursue. In the Pyrrhic, there's basically three general ways that you can play it. This position is no exception. One is to attempt to play the move c5. Obviously, we can't do it here because white is controlling the square, but black can prepare this in a number of ways. For example, starting with the move knight to d7 to support the move d5, starting with the move b6 to support c5, even knight f to d7 is sometimes possible to try to support c5. And basically what black is aiming for is to get a Sicilian type structure, a Sicilian dragon type structure since the bishop is fianchettoed, but having avoided white's most dangerous lines with a very early queen d2 castle queen side and trying to give checkmate. Generally speaking, this is black's best plan in the Pyrrhic if he can achieve it naturally. Like if black is able to play c5 and white wasn't able to take, black would be very, very happy to play c5. If after bishop e2, for example, black probably would play c5 and take advantage of a very typical trick in the Pyrrhic, where if white takes on c5, we don't recapture immediately, which would allow a very, very favorable endgame for white, or not even really endgame, more of a queenless middle game, where this bishop is severely blunted by this pawn on e5, and white has tremendous development and central control. But instead, play this very nice move, queen to a5, which threatens to pick up the pawn with the queen, which would be much more convenient, but also attacks the e4 pawn due to the pin on the king. White technically can try to snatch a bunch of pawns, but tactically speaking, these lines tend to work out quite well for black, even if black has to play a move like rook e8 here. And so white generally has to instead castle to break the pin and defend e4 indirectly, after which black gets the desired dragon structure and has a very, very comfortable game. Another plan after bishop e3 that black can pursue is to play for e5. which would lead to a more Philidor type position. And then from there, even there's two ways to play it after e5, which is either to take on d4 or to not take on d4. But either way, e5 is also something that requires support, usually again by bringing the knight to d7. This is, generally speaking, black's second alternative. If c5 isn't possible, you do go for e5. The downside is that after e5, which is maybe even playable in this position, white would generally go ahead and take the pawn. And after this exchange, the bishop on g7 that had a very, very nice long diagonal is now kind of staring at its own pawn. And oftentimes black actually has to reroute this bishop, sort of admit that it's misplaced, and go back through f8 to a more normal square like c5. And so while this isn't so bad for black, and oftentimes this is what you have to do in the Pyrrhic, it sort of defeats the purpose of the opening entirely. You know, why is our bishop on g7 if we had to play e5 anyway? We might as well have just played e5 on move 1 and then put the bishop on a more normal square like e7 or c5, as in the Italian. So this would be an approach. And then the other option is to play, abandon sort of all plans of attacking the center entirely and instead play for the queenside with a move like c6 intending b5 and a rapid queenside expansion. Sometimes this is done in conjunction with the move e5, sometimes e5 is played first and then c6 and b5 is the follow-up, sometimes c6 is played first and then e5 is the follow-up. Sometimes you play c6 and then you play c5 later anyway, even given the loss of the tempo. And so c6 in this position is very normal. It's especially normal in the classical setup after bishop e2, castle, castle. C6 is by far the main line. But after bishop e3, black has sort of a fourth idea, which is very, very unusual in the Pyrrhic. But because white has committed to this kind of setup, it's actually possible again, which is not to play the move c6 preparing b5, but the move a6, also preparing b5. Now, if black actually manages to get this move in, for example, if white plays bishop e2, b5, now black is already threatening b4 to undermine the defense of the e4 pawn. And so white doesn't even have time to castle immediately. White actually has to play a move like a3, after which black gets very, very rapid development with tempo on this pawn, and has a very, very pleasant option of playing knight d7 and c5, sort of going for the Sicilian structure again, where a6, b5 is a very common idea anyway. Could also go for e5. Lots of options. Black in this position is doing very, very well. And so after a6, white generally goes for a fairly automatic reaction. My opponent actually spent some time thinking here, but it's generally automatic in most positions, actually, not just the Pyrrhic, but some Sicilians, certainly some like King's Indians or like Benoni's, like any sort of structure where black is playing for a6, b5 and queenside expansion, is for white to shut it down with the move a4. Just preventing the move b5 entirely by controlling the square with a pawn. And so you might wonder now, like, what the whole point of including a6 and a4 was for black. And the main point is that this a4 move has weakened the b4 square, which means that the knight has a very comfortable home there in a lot of positions. So after, for example, like, if black plays, well, either e5 or c5, and ends up exchanging on d4, or even not exchanging on d4, just sort of in general, black can often put the knight on b4 where it will very comfortably support the advanced d5, trying to challenge the center even further. And if black gets both the moves e5 and d5, or c5 and d5 in, and white's center collapses, then we start to see the power of this bishop on the long diagonal. And black often can even stand better if white isn't particularly careful. So one option here is to play the move knight c6, intending to bring the knight to b4. But even more accurate is to play the move b6. Again, we're taking advantage of the fact that white has spent quite a bit of time to set up his development. This h3 move is useful to secure the position for the bishop, but it does cost a tempo. And since this bishop no longer has access to g4 or really any square that's useful along this diagonal, b7 is its very, very natural home. And so the bishop will want to come to b7. It would have been better to get b5 in to be able to put the bishop on b7, but b6 is almost as good since we have also forced white to spend a tempo on a4. So in this position, white has a very, very wide variety of options. One is to play e5, which is very combative, arguing that, okay, if you're going to put the bishop on b7, you've weakened control of the e6 square, which is very significant. And so after e5, once the knight moves, white was often ready to sacrifice a pawn here, intending to recapture it with knight to g5. Fortunately for black, we haven't actually committed to bishop e7 yet, and so in this position we can simply play knight f6, and the bishop that's on c8 will control the e6 pawn very comfortably until such time as we're able to kick the knight with h6, and then bring the bishop to b7. So it's a little bit premature for white to go for this immediately, but there are lines where this is certainly a very big system, and even playing out this pawn sacrifice, playing bishop c4, hoping to induce d5, and even just sliding the bishop back, playing this as sort of a true pawn sacrifice where white doesn't get anything immediate for the pawn, but that has compromised black's structure significantly. These pawns are very weak in the center, and the king side is heavily compromised by the lack of a defender on f7. Even this position is very much playable for white, and people have tried it. So this is one option for white. Another option is to play the move bishop to d3, preempting the idea of bishop to b7 by overprotecting the e4 pawn. And after bishop e7, white is very, very happy to simply castle. Again, e5 is worth considering. Now that the bishop has traversed to b7, this would actually be a very, very dangerous idea. There's no good way to defend this pawn anymore. And so after e5, black would actually have to change course and put the knight on d5 instead, which is also fine for black. This is still slightly better for white, but it's certainly a way to play the position. But my opponent in this game chose a very unusual move, queen to d2. I don't think I've actually seen this move before. I'm not really sure, honestly, what this move is aimed to do. I mean, there's sort of vague ideas in the air of bishop to h6, but this seems very optimistic to me. Like, white is not really going to castle queenside after having already committed to a4. The queenside would be very, very weakened if white was going to put his king there. And so bishop h6 is not really that serious an idea a lot of the time. Like, if it's not connected with a very swift attack on the king side as it would be in, for example, the Richter-Rauser variation of the dragon, where you do play f3 and g4 and h4 and h5 and just try to kill your opponent. Here, white is clearly not set up to do that. He's chosen a much more positional approach. And so bishop h6 is usually not very serious. Training the dark square bishops is perfectly fine for black. That might be counterintuitive because this bishop looks very good. It's, we spent a lot of time putting it on the long diagonal where it should be very strong. But in actuality, this dark square bishop generally isn't that good a piece. We talked earlier about how one of black's major plans is to play e5 when this bishop will look very, very sad. And even if we play c5, most of black's pawns are going to be on dark squares. And so this bishop will actually lack a lot of scope. It's actually black's light square bishop that is often the pride and joy of the position, especially after it's developed to the other long diagonal. So queen d2 I think it's probably a fine move objectively, but it seems like a little bit of a mistake to me to do now because, again, we want to put our pieces where we know they're going to go first. We don't know if we want the queen on d2 or e2 or just keep it on d1. It may not need to move at all. Sometimes it'll go to f3, for example, after a plan like bishop d3, bishop b7, castle, let's say knight d7. White can sometimes move this knight out of the way, intending f4, queen f3, and a big advance on the king side. So since the bishop is always going to go to d3, I think it makes much more sense to put it there immediately. But again, queen d2 is not like a serious mistake either. So I played the move bishop to b7. Now my opponent played bishop d3. Again, we could have done it in the other order, but so the other order just gives white like strictly more options. But in this position, it's also not clear like how black should take advantage of the situation. And here I actually made a very, very bad move, sort of immediately, which in some sense justifies this idea of queen d2. What I think is probably correct, I haven't checked with the computer yet, is probably to play the move knight c6, exploiting the weakness of the b4 square that we were talking about earlier. And then we can follow up with moves like c5, d5, trying to put pressure in the center. Maybe a move like rook c8 first, maybe bring the other knight to d7. These are all options that are available in the position. We probably won't actually take this light square bishop because the light square bishop right now isn't a very, very strong piece, but that can sometimes be an option as well, especially if it forces white to compromise the pawn structure by taking back with the pawn. So overall, I think knight c6 was the correct move, but I played a very concrete move, c5, which is basically challenging white to prove something immediately. Now, if white were to take on d5, black would be very, very happy after b takes. Now we achieve not only a good version of the Sicilian Dragon, but probably the absolute best version that you could ever expect from the Sicilian Dragon. White's pieces are tremendously uncoordinated in this new situation. The bishop now no longer belongs on d3, it should be on c4. Holding this e4 pawn is very difficult. White is not ready to attack at all, and he's already committed to never going to the queen side. In this position, black is doing extremely well, maybe even for choice. And if white doesn't take on c5 and instead castles, then black will be very happy to take on d4 as well. The c5 square will be available for the knight, where again there will be a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. This is once again a very, very good version of the Sicilian Dragon for black. We can follow up with moves like e5 and d5, taking control of the center. Black probably even objectively has an advantage already. And so this leaves really the only option for white, which is to advance with d5, which is what my opponent played. And sort of, now the position resembles more of a Benoni type structure, where we have a very, very beautiful dark square bishop, but our light square bishop has been severely blunted and needs to find either a new job or we need to make this bishop on b7 actually do something. So the main intent of c5 after forcing d5 was to play the move e6, trying to reopen the long diagonal for the light square bishop, which is what I played, but is a fairly serious mistake, as we'll see. In this position, white is actually already substantially better, probably, if e6 is not possible. And black should consider... I should probably even consider b5, trying to go for a more Benko-style type of position. But knight d7 is the more responsible approach. But here I didn't see... I sort of failed to see the danger immediately, and played the move e6. My opponent is basically forced to take. I took. And now if black gets the opportunity to play the move d5, black is doing extremely well, probably even better. And this is what I had sort of foreseen when I played the move c5. But what I overlooked is this tactical resource white has, which is to move bishop to c4 immediately, which looks like a very strange move because it seems to be provoking d5. After d5 takes, now we are hitting this bishop, and if the bishop moves back, we don't have d4 immediately, which would fork the two pieces because of the pin. But after just a simple move like king h8, breaking the pin, there isn't really a good defense to d4. White can move one of the pieces out of the way to at least not lose a piece. But after d4, the light square bishop springs to life. Black's pieces become very, very active very, very quickly, has full control of the center. Black would be much better, maybe even just objectively winning in this position. But after e takes d5, e takes d5, it turns out white doesn't actually have to move this bishop. White can instead exploit a second pin along the d-file with either castles queenside or rook d1 immediately. Probably castles queenside, but I wasn't sure in the game which one was better. Might not even really matter. The point is simply that white has simultaneously introduced this pin, which prevents black from taking the bishop, and also put additional pressure on d5, which can't be defended. White is basically just winning a pawn here. Black probably should be able to hold the endgame. Maybe. White certainly has very, very good winning chances, but black's position is also like not totally lost or anything. But black certainly has no chance to win the game after he takes d5. So in this position, I spent quite a long time trying to come up with an alternative. Because if black doesn't play d5, now there's severe problems with the e6 pawn. For example, with queen e7, defending it once, after knight g5, we have to defend it again. d5 is again not possible, not even no longer not possible. was never possible. And so we have to play bishop c8 to defend the pawn, which is a very, very ugly move to have to play. White has a very comfortable choice of how to continue. Really, anything should offer a very, very safe advantage. But there are even violent tactical possibilities here, like to move knight to d5, which is something that scared me. And the point is that after e takes d5, bishop takes d5, white is giving a fork on the king and rook. Taking doesn't help at all. The fork is renewed. White will simply win a lot of material here, and as long as the queen doesn't get trapped, which it shouldn't, it generally has pretty safe routes out. White is just escaping with not only the material, but also a better position, because black's king is in severe danger. So after a while, I decided the only real choice here is to play d5 anyway, even though white can increase the pressure and black is in big trouble. But after e takes d5, not to take back with the pawn, which would be a true pawn sacrifice and just trying to survive a very bad endgame, but taking with the knight, which does ruin black's structure very severely. Black is very, very much worse here. But it at least doesn't give away material immediately, and it does activate some of the pieces. You know, some of these pieces do stand well, even though they can be traded off immediately. So my opponent here has several options. One is, again, you might wonder, okay, what's wrong with this castle? It's the same problem. The knight, again, can't move because of the pin. White has increased the pressure on d5. You know, what's the difference? Why did we take with the knight instead of the pawn? And the answer is that taking with the pawn, we were unable to defend d5, but now we're able to play the move rook f5 and defend the pawn, not the pawn, but the d5 square from the side. It's a very loose-looking configuration because, you know, instinctually it seems like white should be able to kick this rook somehow with a move like g4, for example, or bishop d3 to e4. And eventually pick up this d5 pawn, but it turns out it's not actually concretely that easy to do so. I didn't see an immediate way for white to just straight up win in this position. I definitely thought this was white's best because, for example, knight g5 forcing me to defend e6 now does allow white to play the move g4, and it's not really clear where the rook should go. I was already considering whether I have to go rook e5 and sacrifice an exchange. But at least black is not immediately losing. So in this position, my opponent chose another approach, which is also seemed very good to me, which was to move knight to g5. Again, forcing me to deal with the threat on e6 immediately. And if I play a move like queen e7, or, well, I can't actually even play a move like queen e7 because the queen is needed to defend d5. But if I play a move like queen d6 trying to defend both, then castles queenside, or any number of moves, maybe knight takes d5 first, and then castles queenside, renews the sort of the same idea, and rook f5 is much less appealing in a position like this. So instead, I thought I was forced to try to reduce the pressure on d5 a little bit, and play the move bishop takes c3, which isn't that bad. I mean, we do give away our only good piece in the position. The dark square bishop has a very pleasant long diagonal, at least. But we do ruin white's pawn structure in the process, so this introduces at least some sense of urgency to the position. Like white, previously, without this move, white would have a very, very safe advantage. White's just better. Even if this tactical stuff on d5 doesn't work out, and white just castles and moves all of his pieces back, white is still better because of this permanent weakness on e6. But by taking on c3, what we do is, okay, maybe it's the right move, maybe it's the wrong move. It's not really clear. It wasn't clear to me during the game if it was actually the move that I should play. But it does force my opponent to do something, because at the very least, you know, now if white does just sort of castle and bring all his pieces back and all of this sort of stuff in the center doesn't pan out, now it's actually white that can be worse with a much weaker pawn structure. Probably not seriously worse, because, you know, white does have the two bishops, and this pawn on e6 is still weak. But it's at least something to work with. It does sort of put white on a little bit of a clock. And so here I played the move queen e7. I think it's a good move. Queen f6 is my first instinct, and probably a lot of players' first instinct, because it puts pressure on c3. But it's kind of fake pressure. because black can never really take on c3. Again, the e6 pawn will come under serious fire. And after a simple move like castles, the queen is actually quite a bit misplaced on f6. Eventually, if we kick the knight, it can come back to e4, where it will gain a tempo, and this pawn will simply be lost, so h6 is out of the question. And later on, if this knight does move back to f3, to e4, wherever, bishop g5 can also be very unpleasant to put further pressure on the queen. So I chose to move queen to e7 instead, which defends the pawn from a much safer location. My opponent played rook d1. This introduces a fairly nasty threat of taking on e6, undermining the d5 pawn entirely. So if we played a move like knight d7, trying to develop pieces which would otherwise be very sensible, now white is tactically winning a pawn in the center and has very, very good chances of winning this endgame. The double pawns are a serious weakness. They're not nothing, but white is an extra pawn, white's minor piece is better, the bishop is better than a knight in a position that is very open, and white has a very, very active rook that can go put pressure on the queen side immediately. So most likely this is simply lost. And so we do have to defend the d5 knight again, which brings us back to our old friend rook to f5, trying to hold the knight from the side. Now this does introduce also a sort of little bit of a threat of our own, which is we are vaguely threatening the idea of knight takes e3, undermining support for the knight on g5, and after white takes back, going ahead and sort of holding our nose and grabbing this knight. It looks very scary, because it will allow white to take on e6 with check and start chasing our king around. But I thought I was able to take it, so if white was able to, if white tried castles, for example, then after takes g5, queen takes e6, king g7. This looks very scary. White's king is very, very open, and we have a number of pieces that are not participating in the game. But I didn't see an immediate way for white to crash through. This check sort of leads nowhere. The king is actually very safe on h6. White could play rook to d7 and pick up 2 pieces for the rook, but since he's already given away a piece, this is now actually an exchange up for black. For several pawns, because this pawn will be dropped as well. White is probably not worse here, but it didn't look losing, which is good. Best I could do. White would actually also be able to take with the pawn is certainly something worth considering, and probably a very good reason that I can't take on e3, for example. If I take with the queen, then bishop e6 picks up the rook, and black's king is simply too weak with, again, no pieces participating. If we take with the rook, then white has some very nasty ideas that start to come into play, forcing the king forward. And even here I wasn't 100% sure what the evaluation of the position was supposed to be, but it looked very, very unpleasant. If nothing else, I thought rook f8 was very concerning, bringing the other rook to f7. Well, I guess not rook to f8 there, because we are threatening g2, but there are some lines that look scary. Maybe this is what I was looking at, and then takes here. Now the threat on g2 is much less relevant. Black can maybe survive these positions, but it's certainly unpleasant. And in any case, white can sort of avoid any of these concerns entirely by simply defending the knight on g5 with either the move h4 or f4. Both looked very scary to me. f4 I thought was probably white's best, because it also takes away the e5 square from the rook. So now white is again reintroducing the threat of knight takes e6 sort of indirectly by including the move g4 at some moment. So after knight d7, white could play probably the immediate g4. The rook, if the rook moved back, then we see the same idea as before, where white undermines the support of d5 and we have no good response. White picks up a pawn and probably the game. It's an even better version of the endgame, since white has managed to claim some space with g4. And so after g4, we would pretty much have to go ahead and take on e3, trying to hope that this rook is enough for us to get back in the game, but it's really not, because, again, white is going to take on e6, take on d7, emerge from the complications up a pawn, and with a very serious attack that black is very, very, very unlikely to survive. So f4, black would have to do something completely different, and honestly, I'm not sure what. At this point, I didn't really have a good answer. I haven't checked with the computer, but there's a serious possibility that black is simply lost. And so I was very, very happy that my opponent instead played the move knight to f3, which gives what black sort of much needed time to get back into the game, complete the development of these queenside pieces that look absolutely awful, and now I started to feel like, okay, the tide is turning. My position is probably kind of okay again. So I played the move knight d7, completing some of the development. Now at least the minor pieces are developed. Now I'm intending to bring the other rook to f8, maybe the knight to e5, start putting some serious pressure. The light square bishop is actually a very, very good piece now. And white's king starts to feel a little uncomfortable. It pretty much has to go to the king side now, because white has already moved the rook. The king can no longer go to the queen side. And on the king side, all the pieces are really starting to point in that direction. You know, black has a lot of ways to start generating an attack. And so in this position that probably black is close to equal, maybe white is still slightly better, but I wasn't really sure what white's actual best move was. I think white is probably supposed to castle here and just sort of play on and hope that he doesn't get mated. But my opponent sort of blinked with the move bishop to d3. In principle, this move makes a lot of sense. White wants to play the move c4 and sort of remove this knight from the very powerful square d5. This knight has actually turned into a very, very powerful piece all of a sudden. So trying to play c4 and remove it makes a lot of sense, while also harassing this rook. And so if black did move the rook back, there actually aren't any real good squares for it. We can't go to f6 because of bishop g5. We could technically go to f7, but then the knight can return to g5 with tempo, where it's very well placed. And if we go to f8, the bishop can come to h6, also developing with tempo. The rook again has no square in the f-file, so we'd have to go somewhere else. And now white's pieces have sort of escaped any danger of being taken. c4 would kick the knight, and black at this point, it looks like a very passive position. This weakness on e6 is very, very serious. The weakness of the king is also very, very serious. White stands substantially better. And so this sort of forces black to sacrifice the rook, as a wise chess master once said, by taking on f3. On the one hand, this does force black to give away material, so bishop d3 has one material. On the other hand, black is very happy to give away this exchange. I probably would take on f3 even unprompted. After castles, which I think is white's probably best move, I was already considering taking on f3 anyway, even unprompted. And the reason for this is that, you know, black has now destroyed white's structure on both sides of the board. So this king has no safe home. It can't go to the queen side even if it wanted to, but even if it did get to the queen side, it wouldn't be safe there, because the pawn structure on the queen side has been destroyed. And on the king side, the pawn structure is also destroyed, plus there's sort of pieces raining down. So this looks extremely scary for white, even despite the material advantage, because this is white's extra rook, and it's very, very difficult for it to get into the game. It takes sort of at least like 3 moves, either by castles and rook e1, and then, like, I don't know, moving this dark square bishop out of the way, or by playing like rook g1 to rook g4 to rook e4, some like strange maneuver like this, for it to participate in the game at all. And in the meantime, this knight, which is the sort of direct counterpart now to this rook, is immediately into the game. So the immediate effect of this rook for knight trade is that the knight is actually quite a bit better than the rook. I was very, very happy with my position at this point. So here I played the move knight to e5, which immediately puts the question to white's setup. This pawn needs to be defended somehow. White has a few options of how to do it. Probably bishop e2 is the most reasonable, just trying to keep all of the squares under control, both f3 and c4. And then white is intending to castle and try to activate the pieces. But even this looks very, very scary for white. Black has a number of moves. Queen f6 is probably most to the point. We're now threatening to take on f3 and bring the queen into the game, when black is doing very, very well, but we're also threatening the tactical idea knight takes c3. So if white were to castle here, knight takes c3, white is not able to take this knight back because we have this very important discovered attack on the queen. So after takes, well, actually, maybe white is kind of okay to do this in this particular position because he gets enough material. But this idea is always in the air, and white needs to be very, 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 very careful not to allow it at the wrong moment. I suppose in this case, actually, this probably wins for a different reason, which is that we don't take the queen, but instead take the bishop, and there's no way for white to stop checkmate along the long diagonal. So a lot of tactical possibilities in the air, a lot of different ideas for black. I'm actually not sure what white should really play here. I thought probably the move f4, which looks very dangerous, opening the long diagonal, but if you gotta do it, you gotta do it, you know? White is maybe giving the exchange back and reaching a sort of okay, maybe even still slightly better endgame, because this pawn continues to be weakness and can be attacked by the light square bishop very comfortably. But my opponent instead chose to defend with bishop e4, which looks much more active, but has a fatal flaw in that it allows the move knight to c4. The bishop was needed on e2 to cover this square specifically. And now after knight c4, the queen is evicted from the defense of c3, so black is about to pick up this pawn. And more importantly, this queen actually doesn't have a very good square to go to. If it goes to d3, black has knight b2, forking the queen and the rook. And once black regains the material, black is simply much better because the pawn structure is massively damaged. If white goes to c1, the queen is simply too far out of the game at this point. Black has a very pleasant choice of how to continue, but one of the most direct that I saw in the game was to play takes, and queen to h4, forcing the king to a very uncomfortable position, either on f1, where it'll be vulnerable along the f-file, or e2, where it will be very, very stuck in the center. And so the only move left, which my opponent played, was queen to e2, at least trying to attack the knight. Now, if black takes immediately on c3, white does take the knight and emerges that material, so we take the bishop on e3 first. White is forced to take back, bishop to d5, fails to knight takes d5, and now black has two pieces for the rook. So a material advantage in addition to the weakness of the pawn structure. So after takes on e3, my opponent is forced to take back with the pawn. Knight takes c3, and now we reach sort of the final critical moment of the game of how white should attempt to defend. White has two options. One is to give away the queen by taking on b7. And now black has two options as well. This is one of the first moments where the team dynamic, this being a team tournament instead of an individual tournament, is sort of relevant. Because black has two choices. One is to take the queen and give away the rook. Now white has two rooks for a queen and a pawn. The material technically is equal. From a perspective of, you know, if you just add up, rooks are worth 5, queen is worth 9, pawn is worth, like, a very naive sort of read of the situation, the material is in some sense equal. But white's king is very weak, and the queen and the knight coordinate extremely well. So in this position, black actually has two very appealing choices. I personally liked knight to g3, hitting this rook, forcing a move like rook h2, and then bringing the queen in with queen h4, trying to put pressure on the king. This would be very good. The other is to play knight c3, which my opponent preferred, and then just simply take the pawn on a4 and try to start marching the queenside pawns. In either case, black is objectively basically winning, but during the game I wasn't so sure, because anytime you have like a material imbalance like this, it can be very scary. Like, if white does manage to coordinate the rooks by getting the second rook to the d-file and start putting them on like d8 and d7, there is potential for this to go wrong. Black can even lose the game if we play like some lackadaisical moves and don't really make any progress. And so after bishop takes b7, there's actually a second approach, which is simply to take the bishop, saying, okay, black now has a full pawn for the exchange because we took on c3, and we're going to get the exchange back. So if you do nothing, we're just up a pawn. This means that white has to play the move queen c4, trying to get the pawn back. Knight takes d1, takes on e6 with check. Now black could even play queen f7, and this would be a completely drawn endgame. So black has the option of forcing a draw. But also, like, black is simply able to move the king away because there is no perpetual. The queen controls the squares very nicely. And so black will emerge from this sequence with maybe even an extra pawn, but more likely just a much better position after sort of something like this endgame. It's very, very pleasant for black because the rook is just so much better than its counterpart. Maybe queen d7 is more accurate to control the d-file. And so in a team situation, in an individual situation, it doesn't really, like, this option is not real. You don't really consider taking on b7 because knight e2 is almost certainly winning. And you just sort of trust yourself to play the position after knight e2 correctly, especially against a weaker player. And you say, okay, I'm just going to win this position. But in a team situation, this can be a little bit different, because if you're in a situation where your team is likely, at this point, it's still sort of early in the round, so you're not going to have like a guaranteed result yet, especially in an event with an 2200 rating cap. Like, we're talking about relatively low-level games compared to title players, and so sort of anything can happen. But you can make sort of reasonable guesses of what the match is going to look like. And at this point, if I remember correctly in the match, it did sort of look like we were trending towards what was likely to be a 2-1 score. And when you have a 2-1 score and you have the option of forcing a draw, even in a winning position, it's kind of tempting. You know, you do give up sort of a lot of equity because you're probably in a winning position, but you do secure the match, which is very, very important. Again, this is a small field. This is a large field with a very, very small number of rounds, so you basically need a perfect score. And so there is something very appealing about just taking the sort of guaranteed match victory. And if we had been closer to 2-1, like if all the games had finished, or if it was like guaranteed that we would be 2-1, then this is an option I would have to seriously consider. But fortunately, my opponent didn't make me do any of those considerations, and instead played queen c4. Which probably objectively is like technically a better defense, but in practice, I think black now wins this position every time. Mostly because we have to move bishop takes e4, which is, in my mind, kind of critical. At the time, maybe taking on d1 was also fine, but this sort of puts all doubt to rest, because now if white goes ahead and takes the knight, we take on f3, forking the rooks, and we will emerge from the position up 2 pawns in a queen and rook endgame, plus the advantage of the safer king. So this is very, very easily winning. And if white takes back on e4, which is what my opponent played, then after simply grabbing the rook, we're only up 1 pawn, but the structure is decimated, this rook is not playing, white's king is very, very weak. I thought this should be a very, very comfortable victory at this point. So at this point I started getting a little probably too fancy. Queen f6 was my initial instinct, just putting the queen on a good square, threatening a1, bring the queen to e5, where it would be very nicely centralized. But I played the move b5, which I think is also fine, probably a little unnecessary, but I calculated a concrete line associated with it. White, of course, cannot go ahead and take this pawn because the rook comes to life on the a-file. We pick up the rook in the game. So white has to move the queen back to c3, I was hoping, because now after check, the king pretty much has to go to c1. If it goes to e2, it's going to fall under very, very serious attack from the combination of the queen and the rook. So c1 is its best option to try to retain at least some safety. And here we have the very nice move, queen to g7. So at this point, white can't really exchange because the rook endgame is completely hopeless. Again, these pawns are very, very weak, so these kind of count as 1 pawn. Black is basically up 2 pawns in the endgame. This pawn is completely uncontested, and white's king has no way back into the game, so this is a very, very simple conversion. And if the queen moves away somewhere, say a5, then queen a1 is just checkmate on the board. So white is practically obligated to go for this move e5, but now this pawn simply drops after rook to d5. So at this point, white was already busted, but now it's very, very clear that white is losing a second pawn and the game with it. So my opponent tried to try to escape a little bit with the move a takes b5. A takes b5, queen a5, trying to generate some counterplay, which makes some sense. Really the only way to try to get anything. But after queen takes e5, the queen simply just doesn't have enough scope to put any real challenge to the king. So my opponent gave a couple checks, but after king h6, we are escaping quite comfortably. There are no checks remaining, and again, we're threatening queen a1 checkmate. My opponent took on b5 to be able to respond to queen a1 with queen b1. Now here we have a few options of how to proceed. A very direct approach is to simply give a couple of checks, pick up this pawn with check, and then play any move like c4. White, at this point, can't really go for queen c1, which is what he would want to do to try to muster some defense of the king, which is in serious trouble. Because this endgame, again, black is up 2 pawns. This pawn, the pass pawn, we make a pass pawn very easily and run it to victory. So this would be a very, very convincing way to end the game as well. But I wanted to simplify things by not even needing to show the technique in the 2-pawn up rook endgame, which probably wasn't necessary. I mean, my opponent probably would have resigned upon entering the endgame anyway. But I found an even nicer approach to give checkmate instead. We played the move c4, opening up an attack on the queen. White cannot take this pawn because of checkmate. White needs to stay on the b file. So my opponent played queen to b6, which makes sense, otherwise we would take e3 with check. This is the only move to defend it. And now after check, we played a very nice, I thought a very nice move, queen a5, threatening queen to d2, and as well as rook to b5. So we're both threatening to win the queen by direct approach with queen to d2, but also threatening to just trap it with rook to b5. So if white played like rook h2, we would have queen e1, but we would also have the option of rook b5, winning the queen either way. So my opponent found a good defense, which I actually overlooked, which was to move queen to b8. Now queen d2 is not actually that dangerous anymore because the king simply slides to the b file. And white is actually threatening to give some serious number of checks, so we're not able to just do nothing. If the queen comes to f8 and forces the king forward, then white is actually sort of seriously considering making a perpetual. I'm not sure if white actually does manage to make a perpetual here, but there's no reason to even bother. After queen b8, there's a number of ways to deal with the situation, but I found one of them, which was simply playing the move rook to d8. And now this check on f4 is harmless. After king g7, all of the squares on the long diagonal are covered, and so white is completely out of checks, and there's no good defense to mate. So my opponent tried to stay on the b file, but after c3, the last remaining squares of the king are taken away. Black is threatening to play queen a1, queen b1, queen a3, so for example, if white tried to activate the rook, we first force the queen to b1 to take away the final square from the king, and then after queen a3, checkmate is coming through. So king b1 is forced to try to take away the a1 square, but after rook a8, there is no check for white, no way to defend the a file, and here my opponent resigned. So overall, I felt reasonably happy with the game. My opponent had a very, very, very promising position at the opening, but after one mistake, with bringing the knight back to f3 in this position, I felt that I played very, very well. And more importantly, my teammates actually managed to, well, in some cases convert their positions, in some cases turn around what looked like a very uncomfortable position, and we actually won the match by a perfect score of 4-0, which even is kind of rare, even for a lopsided match. 4-0 against, like, you know, when you play somebody 200 points down, you're expected to score something like 75%, which is quite high. But when you have 4 people that are all playing 200 points down, 75% 4 times is actually not that common. You don't really expect it more than one every, like, 3 matches or so. So I was very, very happy to get a 4-0 start, obviously as good a start as you can hope for. Probably our best start in this event ever. I don't think we've actually 4-0'd round 1 before. It's been the same team for the last 5 or 6 years, so we have a lot of experience playing together. And so, you know, nothing more to say. Like, what else can you ask for besides a 4-0 start? So yeah, I think this was a pretty good. I was very happy with the game, especially after The Blitzfield Invitational, where we had some very very complicated, difficult positions. This felt relatively smooth in comparison, even though the opening was a bit of a disaster. And I felt kind of good about my play going into round two, which we will see next time it's round two on the same day. Thanks for watching. I will see you all next time for round two.